Today on the Daily Dose, California's immigration history. Named California by Spanish soldiers and missionaries, after California was handed to the United States from Mexico on February 2, 1848, ending the two-year Mexican-American War, the discovery of gold at Sutter's Mill that same year set off the first wave of American and foreign immigration into the Golden State, increasing the non-indigenous population to 92,587, as recorded in the U.S. Census of 1850. New Yorkers and immigrants from other northeastern states led the wave of new arrivals, followed by immigrants from Mexico, Ireland, and Germany, increasing the statewide population to 560,000 by 1870. Other boom-inspired migrations would follow, including a real estate boom in the 1880s, oil in the 1890s, and orange and fig farming by the turn of the century. Yet the largest internal migration wave in American history occurred in 1920 Southern California, when land speculators advertised the region as a new Eden on Earth, replete with warm breezes and endless sunshine, topped off by a seemingly endless Pacific Ocean coastline. During the Roaring '20s, 2 million people moved to Southern California, while Los Angeles alone gained 1,272,000 new citizens. Silent movies in the 1920s sparked the rise of Hollywood glamour, while a further real estate boom increased suburban populations in the 1930s. An abundance of jobs fueled California's growth during the war years of the 1940s, while the Cold War space race of the 1960s witnessed the steady influx of engineers and scientists into the state. That same decade, the hippie counterculture movement sparked a different sort of migration into the San Francisco Bay Area, culminating in the Summer of Love in 1967. Today, an estimated 39 million Americans call California their home, making the Golden State the most populated state in the nation, while 27%, or 10,564,000 Californians, were born outside of the United States. In 2022, California's gross state product clocked in at a whopping $3.63 trillion, making it the largest subnational economy in the world. Hypothetically, if California were its own sovereign nation, the state's economy would make her the fifth largest in the world, making California immigration history a cross-sectional example of America's melting pot experience. Today on the Daily Dose, Ellis Island. Between 1880 and 1924, nearly 25 million immigrants left their homelands for dreams of a better life in America. Coming mainly from northern, southern, and eastern Europe, nearly half of the sustained immigration wave came through Ellis Island. Of the 12 million who entered America through the island, tens of thousands were detained at Ellis Island hospitals for possible infectious diseases or other debilitating health concerns. With nearly 6,000 immigrants arriving at Ellis Island each and every day, the facility required a massive hospital infrastructure to keep up with the flow. A 120-bed general hospital was built first, which would eventually expand to 3 times that size. A second psychiatric hospital sported 50 beds and an equal number of isolation rooms, while a 450-bed contagious disease hospital became the island's flagship structure. The flood of immigrants through Ellis Island brought with them their deepest hopes for a better life, but many arrived with a wide variety of highly infectious diseases. In a time before antibiotics, contagions like cholera, diphtheria, typhus, tuberculosis, and polio could spread throughout communities with fatal consequence, which made Ellis Island a key barrier to the spread of infectious diseases into American cities. While wealthy first-class passengers were hardly given more than a glance before clearance, For those arriving in steerage class, a thorough medical examination stood between their freedom in America or a swift deportation back to where they came. Every arriving immigrant had to climb the large staircases that led to the Great Hall. At the top stood a line of uniformed public health officers who watched intently for signs of heart trouble from the climb, breathing difficulties, or any kind of physical or mental impairment. The immigrants would then be interrogated by members of the U.S. Immigration Bureau, asking each new arrival why they came to America and how they intended to support themselves. They were then herded past a dozen or so doctors working the line, as it was known, who had 30 seconds to determine whether the immigrant in front of them merited a more comprehensive medical exam. 1 in 5 immigrants received a chalk mark indicating a suspected condition, which would subsequently open them up for further testing and diagnosis in one of the 3 main hospitals. In use from 1892 to 1924, Ellis Island is now part of the Statue of Liberty National Monument. More than 350 babies were delivered on the island, many of the newborns named after the doctors and nurses who helped them into the world. On the downside, however, more than 3,500 arriving immigrants died on the island, making the 27-acre landmark a key focal point in the story of America. Today in the Daily Dose, the Chinese Exclusion Act. Following the Opium Wars against Great Britain, China's crushing war debt, combined with a protracted stretch of floods and droughts that left many Chinese peasants seeking new opportunities abroad. Many Chinese found their way into California after James Wilson Marshall's 1848 discovery of gold at Sutter's Mill. Combined with another devastating crop failure in China, some 20,000 Chinese immigrants passed through San Francisco's Customs House in 1852, up from 2,716 the previous year, igniting a racially charged spree of violence by whites who saw the Chinese as a threat to their ongoing ability to earn a living wage. Later that same year, in an effort to curb the violence and allay the fears of white miners, California imposed a foreign miners' tax of $3 a month, despite the fact that Chinese laborers worked for less money and longer hours than whites, often given the most dangerous and backbreaking jobs in a given mining operation. To worsen the plight of Chinese immigrants, the 1854 Supreme Court case of People v. Hall ruled that the Chinese, like African Americans and Native Americans before them, were no longer allowed to testify in an American courtroom, further limiting their ability to seek justice against the rising flood of white-inspired violence. During construction of the first transcontinental railroad, after Charles Crocker and other founders of the Central and Southern Pacific Railroads placed employment ads for white workers, when only a few hundred white men applied, Crocker began hiring less expensive Chinese workers to fill the labor vacuum. Before the tracks came together at Promontory Point, Utah, on May 10, 1869, some 15,000 to 20,000 Chinese laborers had almost single-handedly built one of the greatest engineering achievements in American history, working from sunup to sundown 6 days a week, all for $26 a month. Signed into law by President Chester A. Arthur on May 6, 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act furthered the nation's racist tenor by suspending all Chinese immigration for a 10-year period, at the same time excluding Chinese Americans already in the country from seeking naturalization as U.S. citizens. And while Chinese Americans challenged the constitutionality of the law in court, all of their efforts failed to bring about justice. The immigration ban was extended an additional 10 years thanks to the Geary Act of 1892, followed by the Immigration Act of 1924, which extended the nation's exclusionary practices to not only the Chinese, but other undesirable groups, such as Hindus, Middle Easterners, and the Japanese. Chinese immigration into the U.S. plummeted as a result, until the Magnuson Act of 1943 at long last made Chinese Americans eligible for U.S. citizenship. Today on the Daily Dose, the early history of American immigration. During the last Ice Age, some 20,000 years ago, the first Native Americans crossed a narrow land bridge connecting Asia to North America, yet the Indians, named such by Christopher Columbus, who wrongly believed he had landed in India, would soon be overrun by a flood of European immigrants by the early 1600s. Spanish colonies dotted Florida, while the British settled in New England and Virginia. The Dutch took up residency in modern-day New York City, while the Swedes settled in Delaware, seeking both religious freedom and greater economic opportunity. Still others were brought to America against their will, including millions of Africans, plucked from their native soil. In March of 1790, Congress passed the Naturalization Act, which allowed free white persons of good character to apply for citizenship after 2 or more years of residency, which effectively garnered them with basic constitutional protections, including the right to vote, own property, and testify in court. Following the War of 1812, ending the final conflict between the United States and Britain, by 1815, immigration from Western Europe turned from a trickle to a dam burst, opening up the first major wave of immigration until the Civil War ended a nearly 40-year uptick in immigrant populations. Between 1820 and 1860, Irish Catholics accounted for 1/3 of all immigrants to the U.S., while some 5 million Germans settled mainly in Midwestern cities such as Milwaukee, St. Louis, and Cincinnati. Immigrants overwhelmed most major East Coast port cities, including New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and Charleston. Ethnic conflicts over a perceived scarcity of jobs brought about rising tensions in most East Coast cities, leading to the formation of one of the first nationalistic, anti-immigrant political groups, the Know Nothing Party. After many states passed their own selective immigration laws, in 1875, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that American immigration policy was the sole responsibility of the federal government, which in turn passed the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, putting an end to the steady influx of Chinese workers into the U.S. who were willing to perform backbreaking labor at extremely low wages. Following its grand opening in January 1892, Ellis Island would welcome some 12 million immigrants from its inception to 1954, despite occasional bouts of xenophobia, including the Immigration Act of 1917, which established literacy requirements for immigrants arriving from Asia, while the Immigration Act of 1924 established nationality quotas and limits on overall U.S. immigration by country. The act caused an uptick in illegal immigration crossing into the U.S. via the Mexican and Canadian borders, prompting federal authorities to establish the U.S. Border Patrol in an early attempt to stem the flow. Today in the Daily Dose, the Espionage and Sedition Acts. Following the immigration waves of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, further stoked by Russia's Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, anti-communist, anti-radical sentiment ballooned in America. On June 15th of that same year, just 2 months after America's entry into the First World War, Congress passed the Espionage Act, which criminalized the conveyance of any information intended to hinder America's ability to wage war, as well as acts that might advance the causes of the nation's Axis enemies. Aimed specifically at disloyal immigrants from Eastern and Southern European nations. Those radicals found guilty of violating the Espionage Act were subject to a 20-year prison sentence and a $10,000 fine, some $235,000 in today's currency. Enforcement of the Espionage Act fell on the shoulders of President Woodrow Wilson's Attorney General, A. Mitchell Palmer, which was further strengthened by the Sedition Act of 1918, imposing additional harsh penalties on anyone found guilty of making false statements intended to hinder America's war effort, as well as stiff penalties on anyone accused of insulting or abusing the federal government, the American flag, the U.S. Constitution, and the U.S. Armed Services. In tandem, the Espionage and Sedition Acts were put in place to muzzle immigrant and homegrown socialists, pacifists, and anti-war activists, although enforcement measures frequently devolved into attacks on African Americans. As Americans became increasingly paranoid about anti-communist, anti-socialist sentiment during the Red Scare of 1919 and 1920, thousands of radicals were rounded up during the now infamous Palmer raids, leading to the trial and deportation of 556 radicals aboard the USAT Beaufort, which soon earned her nickname the Soviet Ark. Most famous of those imprisoned and fined under the Espionage and Sedition Acts was socialist labor activist Eugene Debs, who was sentenced to 10 years in prison for a 1918 speech he made in Canton, Ohio, where he criticized the Espionage Act and America's entry into the First World War. After Debs' sentence was commuted following the repeal of the Sedition Act in 1920, the Espionage Act was further deployed during the Second Red Scare of the 1940s and 50s, when Senator Joseph McCarthy and FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover rooted out suspected communist sympathizers during the early years of the Cold War, making the Espionage and Sedition Acts a major pushback against radical ideologies in America. Today on the Daily Dose, the Immigration Act of 1924. In a country made up almost entirely of Northern European immigrants, America's open-door policy of the late 19th and early 20th century brought with it a melting pot diaspora of foreign cultures and notions of non-democratic governance, leading to growing ethnic pushback from the nation's predominantly Northern European majority, from such places as England, Ireland, and Scandinavia. During the early 20th century, however, the steady arrival of immigrants from Eastern and Southern European nations and Asia led to an uptick in job competition fears, increased labor disputes, and a steady rise in immigrants who embrace communist, socialist, and anarchist ideologies, leading to the Red Scare of 1919 and 1920 and the rise of the eugenics movement in American society. In the years following World War I, many Americans thirsted for isolationist policies in an attempt to weed out radical outside influences, leading to the Immigration Act of 1924, which was signed into law by President Calvin Coolidge on May 26th, effectively embracing a form of strict racial discrimination regarding who could come to America. Under the new law, only immigrants with a college degree or specialized skills were allowed entry, while denying Mexicans altogether and disproportionately limiting immigration from Eastern and Southern European nations and the Japanese. The law also set a 2% immigration quota from any given nation, except of course immigrants arriving from Northern Europe, based on ethnic percentages counted during the census of 1890, which was later dropped in 1927 in lieu of a total immigration cap of 150,000 foreigners per year. While the Immigration Act of 1924 drew immediate and steady opposition by most left-leaning politicians, the isolationist law would remain in effect until President Kennedy introduced a bill to abolish the quota system entirely which at first received little support in Congress. Following JFK's tragic assassination on November 22, 1963, however, incoming President Lyndon Baines Johnson took charge of Kennedy's unfinished business, pledging to honor the memory of our late president. Known for his ability to push legislation through Congress, on October 3, 1965, LBJ signed the Immigration and Nationality Act, which effectively ended ethnic immigration favoritism for Northern Europeans for the first time since the nation's founding, making the Immigration Act of 1924 one of the most racially discriminatory laws in American history. And there you have it, the Immigration Act of 1924, today on the Daily Dose. Get your nerd on with the Daily Dose. And if you enjoyed today's episode, share the link with a friend or colleague so that they too can learn something new every day.